Have you ever watched someone lose the opportunity they needed most, only to discover that character is revealed long after the interview ends? The question lingered like a quiet echo as Malcolm Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his clean navy shirt outside the towering glass headquarters of Bennett Global Holdings. At 30 years old, Malcolm had learned that hope rarely arrived with loud applause. It came disguised as another early morning, another careful shave in the tiny bathroom mirror, another promise whispered to his 8-year-old daughter before school. "I'll be back before dinner, Ava. Wish me luck." She had wrapped her small arms around his waist, smiling with complete confidence. "You're going to get the job, Daddy." Children believed in tomorrow with a certainty adults slowly forgot. Malcolm carried that belief with him as he stepped into the polished lobby, where sunlight reflected across marble floors so spotless they almost looked unreal. Around him, applicants wore tailored suits, expensive watches, polished shoes that had never touched construction dust or warehouse concrete. Malcolm carried only a leather folder that had softened with age and years of careful use. Inside were references from supervisors who admired his work ethic, certificates from night classes, and a resume filled with jobs that kept food on the table instead of impressing executives. He greeted the receptionist with an easy smile. "Good morning." She smiled politely before directing him upstairs. The elevator climbed 43 floors in complete silence. Malcolm watched the city grow smaller through the glass walls. Somewhere below, school buses rolled through busy intersections. Somewhere across town, Ava was probably opening her math workbook with the same determination she brought to everything she did. That thought steadied him. The conference room overlooked nearly the entire skyline. Moments later, Charlotte Bennett entered carrying a slim tablet. At 26, she had already become one of the youngest billionaire CEOs in America. Every movement reflected discipline rather than extravagance. Her platinum blonde hair was neatly arranged, her charcoal dress elegant without demanding attention, and her calm blue eyes scanned Malcolm's resume with practiced efficiency. She thanked him for coming before asking thoughtful questions about leadership, teamwork, and problem-solving. Malcolm answered honestly. He never exaggerated. He never pretended to be someone he wasn't. When she asked why he wanted the position, he smiled softly. "Because every father wants to build something his daughter can be proud of." Charlotte paused for only a second before continuing. She admired his sincerity. She could see kindness in the way he spoke. But kindness wasn't listed among the qualifications she needed today. After reviewing the final page, she folded her hands together. "Mr. Brooks, I truly appreciate your time. Unfortunately, we're moving forward with candidates whose experience aligns more closely with this role." There was no cruelty in her voice, only distance. Malcolm nodded once. Disappointment settled quietly behind his eyes, but it never reached his expression. "Thank you for considering me," he replied as he stood. "I hope you find exactly who you're looking for." Charlotte watched him gather his folder. Most rejected applicants argued. Some demanded explanations. Others blamed the company before leaving. Malcolm simply wished everyone in the room a good afternoon. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Charlotte found herself staring at the empty chair a moment longer than she expected. There had been something uncommon about the man who had just walked away. Not impressive credentials, not remarkable confidence, just an unusual kind of calm that didn't seem connected to success or failure. Down on the sidewalk, Malcolm inhaled the warm afternoon air, glanced once at the city stretching ahead of him, and quietly adjusted the old backpack resting over one shoulder. There were bills waiting at home, groceries to buy, and a little girl expecting him to walk through the front door wearing the same reassuring smile he had left with that morning. So he smiled anyway and kept walking, unaware that before the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, both his life and Charlotte Bennett's would be changed by a single moment neither of them could possibly predict. Malcolm crossed the parking lot with the same steady pace he had carried into the interview, refusing to let disappointment become heavier than the backpack resting against his shoulders. The afternoon sun reflected across the office windows behind him, but he never looked back. Some doors closed quietly, and he had learned years ago that standing outside them would never change the answer. His aging pickup truck started on the second turn of the key, its familiar engine rumbling like an old friend that had seen better days. Before pulling away, he reached for his phone and found a voice message waiting. It was Ava. "Hi, Daddy. Miss Harper put my drawing on the classroom wall today. I cannot wait to show you. I know your interview went great because you always tell me to keep trying, and you always do. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief second, smiling despite everything. I will see you soon, Pumpkin, he whispered before placing the phone on the passenger seat. Instead of driving straight home, he stopped at the neighborhood grocery store where he worked a few evening shifts unloading deliveries. The store manager, Frank Dawson, spotted him near the loading dock. How did it go? Frank asked while signing a shipment invoice. Malcolm shrugged with an easy smile. They found someone with stronger qualifications. Frank leaned against a pallet of bottled water. Their loss. Malcolm simply nodded. Maybe they just needed somebody else today. Frank had known Malcolm for almost 4 years. He had watched him cover extra shifts without complaint, shovel snow before sunrise without being asked, and quietly buy groceries for an elderly customer whose card had been declined. One day, Frank said, somebody is going to hire the man instead of the resume. Malcolm laughed softly. That would be nice. Several miles away, Charlotte Bennett remained inside her corner office, but the interview she thought she had already forgotten kept returning to her mind in unexpected moments. During a meeting, one executive joked that applicants often became desperate after rejection. Charlotte almost answered that one had thanked every employee before leaving, but she stopped herself. It was a strange detail to remember. Stranger still was the feeling that she had overlooked something impossible to measure on paper. She dismissed the thought and focused on the afternoon schedule. Numbers were easier than instincts. As the hours passed, dark clouds gathered over the city, bringing a light summer rain that painted the streets with shimmering reflections. Malcolm finished helping unload the final truck just before 6 o'clock. Frank handed him a paper bag filled with fresh bread that would have expired by morning. Take it home, he said. Ava likes these rolls. Malcolm accepted them with quiet gratitude. Thank you, Frank. Tell her she still owes me a rematch in checkers. Malcolm laughed again. She says you keep letting her win. Do not ruin my reputation, Frank replied with a grin. Meanwhile, Charlotte finally left headquarters after another marathon of meetings and conference calls. Her assistant reminded her about a charity gala later that evening, but Charlotte declined. Not tonight, she said softly. I think I just want to go home. Her driver was unavailable because of a family emergency, so she decided to drive herself for the first time in weeks. She barely noticed the gentle rain as she guided her luxury sedan onto the busy streets. Across town, Malcolm merged onto the same avenue a few minutes later, thinking only about getting home before Ava finished her homework. Neither of them knew their separate journeys were slowly becoming the same road. If you're enjoying this story so far, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Black Dad Destiny. Every day, we bring you touching stories, emotional love stories, and unforgettable journeys inspired by the moments that change people's lives forever. Rain had a way of making the city sound quieter than it really was. Tires whispered across wet pavement. Traffic lights reflected in shimmering pools that turned ordinary streets into ribbons of moving color. Malcolm Brooks kept both hands on the steering wheel as he drove north, the paper bag of fresh bread resting carefully on the passenger seat beside Ava's backpack that he had picked up earlier from school. Her drawing was tucked safely inside, a bright picture of the two of them standing beneath a giant yellow sun with the words, "My dad always helps people," written in uneven blue letters across the top. He smiled every time his eyes caught the corner of the page. At the same moment, several miles ahead, Charlotte Bennett guided her silver sedan through the evening traffic. The windshield wipers moved with steady rhythm, clearing away a light rain that refused to stop. Her phone remained face down beside her purse. She ignored the stream of messages from board members, investors, and assistants. For the first time in weeks, she wanted silence instead of another conversation. Yet silence often invited memories that busy schedules kept hidden. Without warning, Malcolm's words returned to her. Every father wants to build something his daughter can be proud of. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Strange. She had interviewed dozens of applicants that month, but she could barely remember their names. Somehow she remembered his sentence perfectly. At a nearby intersection, an elderly man struggled beside a compact sedan with its hazard lights blinking. Malcolm noticed him immediately. He slowed, rolled down his window, and called out, "Sir, are you all right?" The older man smiled apologetically. "Flat tire. Roadside assistance says another 40 minutes. Malcolm glanced at the dashboard clock. Ava would be waiting, but 40 minutes could feel like forever for someone standing in the rain. He pulled onto the shoulder without hesitation. Let me give you a hand. Within minutes, he had the spare tire mounted while rain dotted his shirt and dampened his hair. The older gentleman reached for his wallet. Malcolm raised one hand with a gentle smile. Please do not. Just promise me that if you ever see someone else stranded, you will stop too. The man looked at him for several quiet seconds before extending his hand instead. My name is Walter. Malcolm shook it warmly. Malcolm. As he climbed back into his truck, he noticed 3 missed calls from Ava's after-school program. His heart skipped for only a moment before. Another message appeared. Everything is fine, Daddy. Miss Harper says not to rush because of the weather. We are making paper airplanes. Relief settled over him like a deep breath. Thank you, Lord, he whispered before continuing down the road. Across town, Charlotte reached a wide intersection where traffic had begun slowing because of the rain. She glanced briefly toward a digital billboard announcing a charity fundraiser sponsored by her company. For an instant, her thoughts drifted back to the interview room, to the applicant who had thanked everyone despite hearing the answer no parent wanted after chasing a better future. The traffic signal turned green. Cars began moving. A delivery van several vehicles ahead suddenly changed lanes to avoid debris that had washed into the roadway during the storm. Brake lights illuminated in rapid succession like falling dominoes. Drivers reacted with startled caution. Charlotte instinctively eased off the accelerator as vehicles around her adjusted their speed. 2 blocks behind, Malcolm noticed the growing line of flashing brake lights stretching across the rain-covered avenue. Experience told him something unusual had happened ahead. He slowed immediately, leaving extra distance between his truck and the vehicles in front of him. Around him, impatient horns sounded from drivers eager to keep moving, but Malcolm ignored them. Ava often reminded him that hurrying never made anyone safer. As rain continued falling against the windshield, the evening seemed to pause, as though the city itself was holding its breath before revealing a moment that would quietly connect 2 lives once traveling in completely different directions. The first sound was not the screech of tires. It was silence, the kind that lasts less than a second but somehow feels long enough for instinct to wake before reason does. Malcolm saw the chain of brake lights brighten across the rain-soaked avenue. Every vehicle ahead slowed at once except one dark sport utility vehicle approaching the intersection from the opposite direction. Its tires lost their confident grip on the slick pavement just enough to send it drifting sideways. It was not a violent movement. It was slow, uncertain, almost graceful in the worst possible way. Charlotte felt the steering wheel pull unexpectedly beneath her hands. She corrected once. Then again. The sedan rotated just enough to leave it resting diagonally near the curb after bumping gently against a decorative concrete planter that absorbed most of the impact. The engine stalled. Steam drifted from beneath the hood. Airbags deployed exactly as designed, surrounding the quiet cabin in white fabric and powdered dust. Traffic stopped instantly. Drivers watched through rain-covered windshields. A few reached for their phones. Others remained frozen, unsure whether to step into the busy roadway. Malcolm had already shifted his truck into park before the last vehicle came to a complete stop. He grabbed his rain jacket, glanced once at Ava's drawing on the passenger seat, and whispered the same words he had told his daughter countless times. If someone needs help, we do not wait for someone else. He stepped into the rain and jogged toward the silver sedan. Water splashed around his boots as he approached the driver's side. Through the partially clouded window, he saw a woman sitting upright, conscious but visibly shaken, blinking as though trying to understand what had just happened. Ma'am, he called gently through the glass. Can you hear me? Charlotte turned toward the unfamiliar voice. Her ears still rang faintly, but she nodded. Malcolm noticed that her seat belt remained secured and that she appeared alert. Good, he said calmly. Stay with me. You are doing great. The driver's door refused to open completely because it rested against the concrete planter. Malcolm walked carefully around the front of the vehicle, checking for a safer opening. The passenger door responded after a firm pull. Rain drifted inside as he leaned just enough to speak without startling her. I am Malcolm. I am going to help you out slowly, all right? Charlotte looked at him through the fading haze of surprise. His face seemed strangely familiar, but her thoughts refused to settle long enough to explain why. She simply nodded again. Malcolm carefully helped release the seat belt and offered his forearm for support instead of grabbing her, allowing her to move at her own pace. "Take your time," he said. "There is no rush." She stepped onto the wet pavement with unsteady feet. A nearby couple hurried over carrying large umbrellas. "We have blankets in our car," the woman offered. "Please bring one," Malcolm replied with quiet gratitude. Within moments, several strangers who had remained inside their vehicles began walking toward them. Someone called emergency services. Another directed traffic around the stopped cars. Walter, the elderly man whose tire Malcolm had changed less than an hour earlier, happened to be driving through the same intersection. He recognized Malcolm immediately, pulled over safely, and hurried across the street. "Need an extra pair of hands?" he asked. Malcolm smiled. "Thank you. Could you stay with her while I make sure everyone else is all right?" Charlotte looked from Walter back to Malcolm. Rain rested on Malcolm's shoulders, but he seemed completely unconcerned with himself. His attention moved from one driver to another, asking simple questions with steady kindness. "Is everyone okay? Does anyone need assistance? Has help been called?" No panic. No shouting. Only calm. Charlotte watched him through the curtain of gentle rain, and suddenly the memory returned with startling clarity. The interview room, the navy shirt, the worn leather folder. The father who had thanked her after she had quietly closed a door he desperately hoped would open. Before she could speak his name, Malcolm had already turned away, walking toward another stranded family whose frightened little boy stood beside the road clutching a soaked stuffed dinosaur. The distant sound of approaching sirens blended with the steady rhythm of rain as flashing emergency lights painted soft streaks of red and blue across the wet pavement. Charlotte sat beneath the shelter of a large umbrella while a paramedic completed a routine examination. "Your blood pressure looks good," he said with a reassuring smile. "You seem to have avoided any serious injuries, but we would still like you to visit the hospital for a full evaluation." Charlotte nodded automatically, though her attention remained fixed somewhere beyond the ambulance. She watched Malcolm from a distance as he helped the frightened little boy climb back into his family's minivan. Kneeling to the child's eye level, he handed over the soaked stuffed dinosaur with both hands as though it were something priceless. The little boy smiled for the first time since the incident. His mother whispered a quiet thank you before embracing her son. Malcolm simply tipped his head and stepped away, never expecting recognition. Walter walked over carrying 2 paper cups of hot coffee that a nearby food truck owner had begun handing out to everyone caught in the rain. He offered one to Charlotte before looking toward Malcolm with quiet admiration. "That young man stopped earlier today to change my tire," Walter said. Charlotte looked up. "Earlier today?" Walter nodded. "Did not know my name. Did not ask for money. Just said if I ever saw someone stranded, I should stop and help them too." He smiled gently. "Looks like he lives by his own advice." Charlotte lowered her eyes to the warm cup in her hands. Hours earlier, she had measured Malcolm through qualifications, experience, and business requirements. Now she was watching strangers measure him through gratitude alone. Those scales felt very different. A police officer approached Malcolm to gather a witness statement. Malcolm answered each question clearly and without embellishment. When asked whether he knew the driver before the incident, he hesitated for only a moment before replying. "We met briefly today." The officer looked surprised. "Friend?" Malcolm smiled politely. "No, sir. Just someone who needed help." Charlotte heard every word. Something settled heavily inside her. Not guilt exactly, but perspective. She realized Malcolm could have easily mentioned the interview or explained that she had rejected his application only hours before. Instead, he protected her dignity by saying almost nothing at all. That choice spoke louder than any accusation ever could. As the officer thanked him, Malcolm glanced at his watch. His smile faded for the first time that evening. 7:23. Ava would already be waiting at Miss Harper's after-school program. He immediately reached for his phone and called. "Daddy." Ava answered happily. "Miss Harper let us build paper airplanes with glitter." Malcolm laughed with relief. "I am on my way now, Pumpkin. Thank you for being patient." "Did you help somebody?" she asked without hesitation. Malcolm blinked. "How did you know?" "Because you sound like you do after you help people." He smiled toward the rain-dark sky. "Yes, somebody needed a little help today." "Then it was a good day," Ava replied simply before saying goodbye. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She had spent years studying leadership, negotiation, finance, and corporate strategy, yet an 8-year-old child had unknowingly summarized success in a single sentence. Then it was a good day. She slowly stood and walked toward Malcolm just as he prepared to return to his truck. "Mr. Brooks," she called softly. Malcolm turned, surprised to see her standing without assistance. "Ms. Bennett, I am glad you are feeling better." There was no bitterness in his voice, no reminder of the interview, no expectation of apology, only genuine relief that she was safe. Charlotte searched for the right words, but every carefully practiced sentence disappeared. You stayed to help everyone." Malcolm glanced around at the families gathering their belongings before smiling gently. "Someone once taught me that difficult days are easier when nobody faces them alone." "Who taught you that?" Charlotte asked quietly. Malcolm looked toward the small backpack resting inside his pickup truck, where Ava's colorful drawing still peeked from the open zipper. His warm brown eyes softened. "My daughter reminds me every single day." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued falling in soft waves, tapping against parked cars and umbrellas as though the city itself wanted to protect the silence between them. Charlotte searched Malcolm's face, expecting to find resentment hidden somewhere behind his gentle smile. She found none. It unsettled her more than anger ever could. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "I owe you more than a thank you." Malcolm adjusted the strap of his backpack before answering. "You do not owe me anything, Miss Bennett." She frowned slightly. "You helped me after." She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence. Malcolm spared her the discomfort. "After we met this morning?" She nodded. "Yes." He smiled with the same calm expression she remembered from the interview room. "Those were two different moments. This morning, you made a business decision. Tonight, someone needed help. They are not the same thing." His answer landed with surprising weight. Charlotte had spent years separating emotion from leadership, believing every decision should be objective. Yet standing in the rain, she realized Malcolm had separated something even more difficult. He had separated disappointment from compassion. Walter quietly excused himself after shaking Malcolm's hand once more. "Your daughter is lucky to have you," the older man said before returning to his own car. Malcolm watched him leave, then checked the time again. Miss Harper would never complain about staying late with Ava, but he disliked making promises he could not keep. Charlotte noticed him glance toward his truck. "You need to go." Malcolm nodded apologetically. "My little girl is waiting for me." Charlotte smiled for the first time that evening. Not the practiced smile she wore during investor meetings or charity galas, but something softer. "How old is she?" 8, Malcolm answered, his eyes brightening immediately. "She believes I can fix almost anything." Charlotte laughed quietly. "Can you?" Malcolm looked toward the cloudy sky before chuckling. "Not even close. I just keep trying because she is watching." Those words lingered in Charlotte's thoughts long after they were spoken. Because she is watching. She suddenly remembered growing up with a father who once told her that leadership was never about speeches. "Someone is always learning from the way you live," he had said. She had not thought about that conversation in years. A company driver finally arrived carrying a dry coat and an umbrella. "Miss Bennett," he said with concern, "the board has been trying to reach you." Charlotte barely acknowledged him. Her attention remained on Malcolm, who was preparing to leave as quietly as he had arrived. "Mr. Brooks," she called again. He turned. "Would you allow me to thank you properly?" Malcolm smiled warmly. "You already have. That is not enough." "It does not have to be." Before Charlotte could respond, Miss Harper's number appeared on Malcolm's phone once more. He answered immediately. "Everything okay?" "Everything is wonderful," Miss Harper said cheerfully. "Ava insisted we save one paper airplane for you because she says every pilot needs a co-pilot." Malcolm laughed with genuine relief. "Tell her I will be there in 15 minutes. Charlotte overheard enough to picture the little girl waiting patiently, with complete confidence that her father would arrive. She suddenly wondered how many evenings Malcolm had balanced impossible choices without anyone noticing. Job interviews, grocery bills, school pickups, extra shifts. Yet somehow he still found time to stop for strangers on rainy roads. As Malcolm climbed into his aging pickup truck, Charlotte noticed the colorful drawing resting on the passenger seat. Even from several feet away, she could make out the uneven blue letters across the top. "My dad always helps people." She stood motionless as the truck disappeared into the evening traffic. The emergency crews packed away their equipment. Drivers resumed their commutes. Rain slowly became a drizzle. The intersection returned to normal as though nothing remarkable had happened. But Charlotte remained beside the sidewalk for another full minute, staring at the empty lane where Malcolm had driven away. For the first time in her career, she questioned whether the most valuable qualification she had ever overlooked had never appeared on a resume at all. The drive home felt different for Charlotte Bennett. The rain had almost disappeared, leaving only scattered drops sliding across the windshield beneath the rhythm of the wipers. Normally, she would have called her executive assistant before reaching the highway, reviewing tomorrow's meetings and discussing market forecasts. Tonight, the phone remained untouched in the center console. Her mind kept returning to one impossible question. How had she overlooked someone whose greatest qualification could never fit inside a resume? At the same time, Malcolm pulled into the parking lot of the neighborhood community center where Miss Harper operated the after-school program. Before he could even switch off the engine, the front door burst open and Ava came running across the sidewalk, clutching a silver paper airplane decorated with blue glitter. Malcolm stepped out just in time to catch her joyful hug. "You are late," she whispered dramatically before giggling. "I know," he replied, kissing the top of her curly hair. "I had to stop because somebody needed help." Ava leaned back with curious eyes. "Did you help them?" "Yes." "Are they okay?" Malcolm smiled. "Yes." She nodded with complete satisfaction. Then it was worth being late. Miss Harper watched from the entrance with a warm smile. "She never worried," she said. "She kept telling everyone that her dad always comes." Malcolm looked down at the colorful drawing still resting inside his backpack and quietly replied, "I try not to disappoint my best customer." Ava laughed, slipping her small hand into his as they walked toward the truck together. Across the city, Charlotte arrived home to a penthouse overlooking thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon. The apartment was elegant, quiet, and perfectly organized. Yet for the first time in years, it felt strangely empty. She poured herself a glass of water, sat beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and opened the digital file containing Malcolm Brooks's application. She read every line more slowly than she had that morning. Warehouse supervisor, delivery driver, night certification courses, community volunteer, strong references praising integrity, reliability, and leadership under pressure. None of those words had seemed extraordinary during the interview. Tonight, they carried entirely different meaning. She pressed the intercom connected to her home office. Her assistant answered almost immediately. "Good evening, Ms. Bennett. Emily, I need a favor." "Of course." Charlotte hesitated before speaking. "Please do not contact Mr. Brooks yet." Emily sounded surprised. "The applicant from this morning?" "Yes." "Would you like me to remove his file?" Charlotte looked once more at the digital resume glowing softly on the screen. "No. I want you to find out everything you can about his professional background, but only through public references and the people he listed. I am not interested in social media or gossip. I only want the truth." "May I ask why?" Emily asked carefully. Charlotte answered after a long pause. "Because today I think I judged the wrong things." The following morning began before sunrise for Malcolm. He packed Ava's lunch, tied her shoelaces, and listened as she proudly explained the science quiz she hoped to ace that afternoon. Before climbing out of the truck at school, she handed him the glitter-covered paper airplane. "Keep this in your truck," she said, "so you remember that good people always find their way home." Malcolm carefully placed it beside her drawing on the dashboard. "I will." Neither father nor daughter noticed the black sedan parked quietly across the street. Inside, Emily lowered her notebook after watching the simple morning routine unfold. She had expected to gather employment information. Instead, she found herself witnessing something else entirely. She reached for her phone and sent Charlotte a single message. "I think you need to meet Mr. Brooks again, but not inside your office." Before we continue, take a quick second to subscribe to Black Dad Destiny if you have not already. If you love powerful family dramas, surprising stories, real-life inspired journeys, and stories with meaningful life lessons, you are in the right place. Your support helps us create a brand new cinematic story every single day. Charlotte rarely canceled meetings. She believed every commitment reflected her respect for other people's time. Yet that afternoon, she quietly postponed 2 board discussions and 1 investor briefing without offering an explanation. Emily noticed immediately, but asked no questions. Instead, She drove the black sedan toward the modest neighborhood where Malcolm lived, following only public information and the addresses listed on his application. "We are here," Emily said softly. Charlotte looked through the passenger window, expecting hardship. What she found instead was ordinary life. Children rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks. An elderly woman watered flowers on a small porch. Neighbors waved to one another without checking expensive watches. It was not wealth that held the community together. It was familiarity. Halfway down the block, Charlotte spotted Malcolm kneeling beside an aging pickup truck that belonged to a young mother, holding a restless toddler. Malcolm tightened the last bolt beneath the hood before wiping his hands on a faded work towel. "Try it now," he said. The engine started immediately. Relief spread across the woman's face. "How much do I owe you?" Malcolm shook his head. "Nothing. Just drive safely." She tried again. "At least let me pay for your time." Malcolm smiled. "Your little guy already paid me." He looked toward the toddler, who responded by waving both hands enthusiastically from his car seat. Malcolm waved back with equal enthusiasm, making the child laugh. Charlotte watched without speaking. A few minutes later, an elderly neighbor struggled to carry 2 heavy grocery bags across the sidewalk. Before anyone asked, Malcolm walked over, picked them up, and carried them to her front door. "Thank you, Malcolm," the woman said warmly. "You keep saving my back." He laughed. "Then you have to keep making those blueberry muffins. Only if you promise to take some home to Ava." "That sounds like a fair deal." Charlotte leaned back against the seat, surprised by how naturally everyone seemed to know him. Nobody greeted him like a hero. Nobody praised him for helping after yesterday's accident. They simply treated him as the dependable neighbor who always showed up. Emily quietly handed Charlotte a folder. "I called every professional reference on his application this morning." Charlotte opened it. The comments were remarkably consistent. Always early. Trusted by everyone. Never complains. Natural leader. Volunteers without being asked. One former supervisor had added a handwritten note. "If I could hire character instead of resumes, I would hire Malcolm every single time." Charlotte closed the folder slowly. "Why did none of this stand out yesterday?" Emily answered honestly. "Because resumes tell us what people have done. They rarely show us who people are." At that moment, Ava came running out of the apartment building carrying a small science project made from cardboard and colored paper. "Daddy," she called excitedly. Malcolm crouched to her height as she proudly held up a model of the solar system. "You remembered Saturn has rings," he said with exaggerated amazement. Ava grinned. "I remembered because you helped me study." She noticed the unfamiliar black sedan parked across the street. "Who was that?" Malcolm glanced over briefly but did not recognize the tinted windows. "Probably someone visiting a neighbor," he replied. Charlotte instinctively lowered her gaze before he could look longer. She suddenly felt as though she were intruding on something deeply personal. She had come hoping to evaluate a job candidate one more time. Instead, she had witnessed a father, a neighbor, a friend, and a man who seemed to live by the same quiet principles whether anyone was watching or not. As Malcolm and Ava walked toward their apartment, the little girl slipped her hand into his. "Daddy." "Yes, Pumpkin. Do you think good things happen after bad days?" Malcolm looked down at her with the same calm smile Charlotte remembered from the interview. "Sometimes they do," he said softly. "But even when they do not, being a good person is still the right choice." Charlotte closed her eyes for a brief moment. She realized she had spent years searching for exceptional employees while overlooking an exceptional human being. The next morning, Malcolm Brooks stood once again beneath the glass entrance of Bennett Global Holdings. This time he was not carrying hope disguised as certainty. He was carrying only curiosity. Emily had called the evening before with a simple request. "Ms. Bennett would appreciate another conversation if you are willing." She had not mentioned a job offer. She had not mentioned the accident. Malcolm almost declined, but Ava had smiled over her bowl of oatmeal and said, "Maybe somebody remembered something important." Children often understood what adults complicated. As he entered the lobby, the receptionist greeted him differently. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Malcolm smiled politely. "Good morning." Upstairs, Charlotte stood alone in the same conference room where they had first met. There were no interview panels, no stacks of resumes, and no presentation screens. Only 2 cups of coffee rested on the table beside a folder that remained closed. When Malcolm entered, she rose immediately. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," he replied. For a few quiet moments neither of them sat down. Charlotte finally broke the silence. Yesterday, I believed I was looking for the most qualified applicant. She paused, choosing each word carefully. Today I realize I was measuring qualifications without fully understanding character. Malcolm listened without interrupting. I visited your neighborhood yesterday, she admitted. I saw the way you treated strangers, neighbors, and your daughter. None of them seemed surprised by your kindness. That told me more than any interview ever could. Malcolm smiled gently. People usually become whatever they practice every day. Charlotte nodded slowly. I made a mistake. Malcolm answered with the same calm voice she had come to recognize. Everyone does. Will you let me correct mine? She opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a formal employment offer, but not for the position he had originally applied for. Instead, it outlined a newly created role leading community partnerships and employee outreach, combining operations, mentorship, and volunteer initiatives. Charlotte looked directly into his eyes. The skills can be taught. Character cannot. I need someone people already trust before they know his job title. Malcolm carefully read every page before quietly closing the folder. Charlotte waited anxiously for his response. Finally, he looked up. May I ask you one question? Of course. If I had never stopped yesterday, would you still be offering me this opportunity? Charlotte did not answer immediately. She respected the question too much to rush it. Probably not, she admitted honestly. But not because you were less qualified. Because I had not learned how incomplete my judgment was. Malcolm considered her answer for several seconds. Then he smiled. Thank you for telling me the truth. He extended his hand across the table. Charlotte accepted it with genuine gratitude. It was not simply the beginning of an employment agreement. It was the beginning of mutual respect. Later that afternoon, Malcolm picked Ava up from school carrying a small paper bag from the bakery near the office. Good news. Ava asked before he had even opened the truck door. Malcolm handed her a chocolate chip cookie. I think today somebody gave me a fair chance. Ava grinned. I told you good things come after bad days. Malcolm laughed softly. Sometimes they do. As they drove home beneath a bright blue sky that looked nothing like the storm from the day before, Charlotte stood alone in her office watching the city below. She finally understood something no business school had ever taught her. A resume may tell you what someone has achieved, but only life reveals who they choose to become when nobody is watching. And sometimes the greatest investment a leader can ever make is not in talent alone, but in quiet character that has been proving itself all along. Every story leaves us with a question. What would you have done if you were in their place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoy touching stories, inspiring life journeys, emotional family dramas, and unforgettable love stories, don't forget to like, subscribe to Black Dad Destiny, and turn on notifications. A brand new cinematic story is waiting for you tomorrow.